Welcome to this journey through one of the most chilling mysteries ever to emerge from the fog-shrouded waters of the Ohio River Valley. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can, not through supernatural horror, but through the calculated darkness that can exist in human heart. We're about to delve into a mystery that gripped 3 states for over 2 decades, where a trusted community figure defied all moral boundaries and left a legacy so disturbing that entire families moved away rather than speak his name. A man who controlled the only passage across treacherous waters became something far more sinister than anyone could imagine. A gatekeeper not just of river crossings, but of life and death itself. It was the year 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition was drawing millions to Chicago, celebrating 400 years since Columbus reached the Americas. Electric lights were beginning to replace gas lamps in major cities, and the Industrial Revolution was transforming America at a breathtaking pace. But in the remote hollows of southern Ohio, along the serpentine bends of the Little Kanawha River, the situation was dramatically different. There, modernity had barely touched the landscape. Communities remained isolated, connected to the outside world only by unpaved roads that became impassable quagmires during spring floods and winter freezes. And in those isolated pockets, where neighbors might live miles apart and law enforcement was days away by horseback, certain men could operate with a freedom that would be impossible in more civilized regions. The Little Kanawha River carved through the Appalachian foothills like a dark artery, its waters murky with sediment, its currents deceptively powerful. During most of the year, it was impossible to cross without a ferry, and for 23 years, that ferry was operated by one man, Silas Abernathy Crane. To the travelers who paid their nickel for passage, he seemed unremarkable. A tall man, gaunt as a scarecrow, with hands weathered by decades of pulling rope and oar. His eyes were the color of river stones, gray, flat, unreadable. He spoke little, which most people attributed to the solitary nature of his work. He lived alone in a cabin built on stone pilings on the eastern bank, a structure that seemed to grow from the riverbank itself, as much a part of the landscape as the willows that draped their branches into the slow-moving water. But Silas Crane was keeping secrets, secrets that would remain hidden beneath the river's surface for over 2 decades. Secrets that would only emerge when the worst drought in 50 years caused the Little Kanawha to shrink to a fraction of its normal flow, exposing what should have remained forever submerged. The region where our story unfolds was known locally as Harrow's Bend, a name that predated any living memory, though some of the older residents claimed it was named for the harrows that hung in every barn, tools for breaking up the unforgiving soil that resisted cultivation. Others whispered darker origins, suggesting the word came from harrowing, describing the feeling that settled over travelers as they approached this isolated stretch of river. The landscape itself seemed designed for secrets. The Little Kanawha curved through a narrow valley here, flanked on both sides by steep, forested hills that blocked the sun for most of the day. Even at high noon, the river lay in perpetual twilight, the water reflecting the dense canopy above in shades of deep green and shadow black. Ancient sycamores lined the banks, their white bark ghostly against the darkness of the water, their root systems exposed like skeletal fingers clutching the eroding earth. Mist rose from the river almost every morning, regardless of season. It would cling to the water's surface until midday, transforming the ferry crossing into something otherworldly. Travelers would emerge from the fog on one side and disappear into it on the other, as if passing between 2 different realms of existence. The locals had grown accustomed to this atmospheric peculiarity, but visitors often found it deeply unsettling. Silas Crane had come to Harrow's Bend in 1870, just 5 years after the Civil War's end. He arrived with nothing but a canvas sack containing his possessions and a faded letter from the county commission granting him the ferry license. No one knew where he'd come from, and he never volunteered the information. In those days, such discretion was not uncommon. Many men were trying to outrun their pasts, whether as Union or Confederate soldiers, deserters, or men wanted for crimes committed during the chaos of war. The county was simply grateful someone was willing to take the position. The previous ferryman had drowned under mysterious circumstances, and the job had remained vacant for 18 months. Commerce was suffering, families were divided by the uncrossable water, and the mail route had to detour nearly 30 miles to reach the next bridge. Silas rebuilt the ferry platform, constructed his cabin, and established a routine that would remain unchanged for the next 23 years. He worked from first light until full darkness, 7 days a week, ferrying anyone who had the fare. Farmers bringing produce to market, traveling salesmen with their cases of patent medicines and miracle tonics, families visiting relatives on the opposite bank, circuit preachers making their rounds, young couples eloping to the justice of the peace in the county seat. The ferry itself was a simple raft, 16 feet long and 8 feet wide, constructed from thick planks and reinforced with iron bands. It could accommodate a wagon and team, or up to a dozen people on foot. The crossing took approximately 12 minutes, with Silas using a combination of oars and a guide rope that stretched across the river, anchored to massive posts on each bank. The cabin where he lived was equally austere. A single room, perhaps 15 feet square, with a stone fireplace that seemed too large for the space. A narrow bed frame with a straw mattress, a rough, hewn table and 2 chairs, though no one could remember seeing a visitor. Shelves holding canned goods, flour sacks, and coffee tins. And always, regardless of weather, regardless of season, the windows remained shuttered from the inside. People noticed, of course. In small communities, everything is noticed and catalogued and discussed. But Silas's eccentricities seemed harmless enough. He wasn't friendly, but he wasn't hostile either. He performed his job reliably, maintained the ferry equipment scrupulously, and kept to himself, which, in Appalachian culture, was considered more virtue than vice. What people didn't notice, or perhaps chose not to notice, were the patterns. In 1876, a traveling salesman named Arthur Whitmore failed to arrive at his destination on the western side of the river, despite several witnesses confirming he'd boarded Silas's ferry on a foggy Tuesday morning. In 1880, a young woman named Rebecca Stillwater, who'd been traveling alone to visit her sister, simply vanished between the eastern bank and the western shore. In 1884, 2 brothers, the Murphy boys, ages 19 and 20, one disappeared after paying Silas for passage during an early morning crossing. Each disappearance was investigated, insofar as investigation was possible in those days. The county sheriff at the time, a man named Josiah Blackwood, questioned Silas on multiple occasions. Each time, Silas provided the same explanation. The passenger had completed the crossing and departed into the hills. Perhaps they'd gotten lost. Perhaps they'd met with an accident on the treacherous roads. Perhaps they'd simply chosen to abandon their previous lives and start anew elsewhere. It happened often enough in those transient times. And each time, Sheriff Blackwood had no evidence to contradict these explanations. The river had currents, certainly, but no bodies ever washed up downstream. Search parties combed the hills but found nothing. The ferry showed no signs of struggle, no bloodstains, no torn clothing. Silas's cabin, when searched, revealed nothing suspicious, just the sparse possessions of a solitary man living a hermit's existence. The disappearances troubled people, yes, but they could be explained by the harsh realities of frontier life. People did vanish, accidents did happen, and without concrete evidence, without bodies, without witnesses, what could anyone do? So life continued as life does. People crossed the river, paid their nickels, and tried not to think too deeply about the ones who'd never reached the other side. And Silas Crane continued his work, pulling the ferry back and forth across the murky water, his gray eyes revealing nothing, his cabin's shuttered windows staring blindly at the river like empty sockets in a skull. The summer of 1893 began with a heat wave that shattered records throughout the Ohio Valley. By early June, temperatures were regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Crops withered in the fields. Wells ran dry. Livestock died by the hundreds, their carcasses rotting in pastures because the ground was too hard for burial. And the rivers began to fall. The Ohio River, that mighty artery of commerce, dropped to levels not seen since the devastating drought of 1838. Barges sat stranded on exposed sandbars. Wheelers struggled to navigate channels that became increasingly shallow with each passing week. And the Little Kanawha, normally a robust tributary, began to reveal secrets it had held for decades. By mid-July, Silas Crane's ferry was no longer necessary. The river had fallen to less than 3 feet at its deepest point, and people could simply wade across, their feet sinking into the revealed mud bottom that released pockets of methane gas with each step, sending bubbles of decay to the surface. This development affected Silas's income, certainly, but that wasn't what drew people's attention. What captured their notice, and gradually transformed their casual observation into horrified fixation, was what the receding water revealed beneath the ferry platform on the eastern bank. The ferry landing had been constructed on wooden pilings driven deep into the riverbed, creating a framework that extended out into the water. Under normal conditions, this framework was submerged, visible only as dark shapes beneath the surface. But as the water level dropped, more of the structure became exposed, and with it, something else emerged. The first discovery was made by 2 children brothers named Thomas and William Hendricks, ages 8 and 10. They'd been sent by their mother to fill buckets from what remained of the river, despite her warnings to stay away from the ferry landing. But children, of course, are drawn to the forbidden, and the exposed framework beneath the platform presented an irresistible opportunity for exploration. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Wedged between 2 pilings, partially embedded in the mud, but now revealed by the drought, was a human skull. The bone had been stained brown by the river water, and thin strands of what might have been hair or water weeds clung to it. Empty eye sockets stared upward toward the surface, toward the light that had been denied them for untold years. The boys ran screaming to their mother, who alerted their father, who rode immediately to fetch Cher, if Thaddeus Morrison, Josiah Blackwood's successor, a younger man, newly elected, who'd heard the stories about the disappearances but had never seriously investigated them. By sunset that evening, half the county had gathered on the riverbank. Oil lanterns were lit as darkness fell, casting dancing shadows across the exposed mud. Sheriff Morrison, accompanied by his deputy and several volunteers, began a systematic search of the area beneath and around the ferry platform. What they discovered in those first few hours defied comprehension. 6 more skulls, fragments of what appeared to be human ribs, femurs, vertebrae, scraps of fabric, the remains of clothing that had long since rotted away but left ghostly impressions in the mud. A woman's boot, remarkably preserved by the anaerobic mud, still containing the small bones of a foot, a man's leather belt with a tarnished brass buckle, and perhaps most disturbing, lengths of heavy chain, the kind used to anchor boats, attached to what appeared to be iron bars that had been driven into the riverbed like stakes. The chains were corroded but still intact. Some still had fragments of rope attached to them, rope that had been tied around what could only have been human limbs. As dawn broke on the following day, the full horror became apparent. The area beneath the ferry platform was a burial ground, or more accurately, a dumping ground. The positioning of the remains suggested they'd been weighted down deliberately, chained to the riverbed to prevent them from floating to the surface. The bones showed signs of trauma: skulls with fractures, ribs with what appeared to be knife marks, vertebrae that had been separated with brutal force. Sheriff Morrison ordered a complete excavation of the site. Over the next 3 days, working in the brutal heat, volunteers carefully removed layers of mud and silt, documenting everything they found. The final count was staggering: 17 skulls. Remains consistent with at least 23 individuals. The extra 6 skulls remained unaccounted for, their other bones either swept away by currents or buried beyond reach in the deeper mud. Personal effects that could be traced to at least 9 of the people who'd disappeared over the years. Arthur Whitmore's initialed pocket watch, still keeping time despite its long submersion. Rebecca Stillwater's locket containing a photograph of her parents, a ring belonging to one of the Murphy brothers, a Bible with an inscription identifying its owner as a circuit preacher who'd vanished in 1887. The community's shock transformed into rage. Where was Silas Crane? How could he explain this charnel house beneath his ferry platform? What manner of monster had they welcomed into their midst, paid their money to, trusted with their safety for 23 years? But Silas was nowhere to be found. His cabin stood empty, door hanging open, shutters finally thrown back to reveal dark windows like accusing eyes. Inside, the furnishings remained untouched. The bed made with military precision, dishes washed and stacked, the oversized fireplace cold and swept clean. It appeared he'd simply walked away, taking nothing with him except possibly the clothes on his back. Sheriff Morrison organized search parties that combed every hill, hollow, and cave system within 20 miles. Bloodhounds were brought in from Cincinnati, but they lost Silas's scent at the river's edge, suggesting he'd waded downstream to avoid pursuit. While the manhunt continued, Morrison began the grim task of trying to identify the victims. He compiled a list of every person reported missing in the region over the past 2 decades, then began matching them against the recovered remains and personal effects. The pattern that emerged was chilling in its calculation. Silas had been selective. He'd never targeted locals, people whose disappearance would trigger immediate, intense investigation. Instead, he'd chosen travelers, people passing through, those who wouldn't be missed immediately and whose absence might be attributed to a dozen other causes. Salesmen who could have moved on to the next territory, young people who might have decided to start new lives elsewhere, drifters who had no family waiting for their return. He'd also chosen his timing carefully. Never more than 2 or 3 disappearances per year. Never in rapid succession, always spacing them out enough that patterns wouldn't be immediately apparent, and almost always during periods of fog, when visibility was poor and witnesses would be uncertain about what they'd seen. The community that had once defended Silas, who'd insisted there was no evidence of wrongdoing, now turned on themselves with equal ferocity. How had they not seen? How had they explained away so many disappearances? What kind of people were they? that they'd allowed this to continue for 2 decades? The answer, of course, was that they were ordinary people, people who wanted to believe the best of others, people who found it easier to accept mundane explanations than to confront the possibility that evil walked among them, people who'd needed that ferry service and perhaps hadn't wanted to look too closely at the man who provided it. The search for Silas Crane consumed the late summer and early fall of 1893. Wanted posters were distributed throughout Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Telegraph messages were sent to sheriffs in every county within 100 miles. Newspapers as far away as Cleveland and Cincinnati ran detailed descriptions of the fugitive, accompanied by the only known photograph of him, a grainy image taken years earlier for his ferry license showing a gaunt man with hollow eyes and no expression. But it was ultimately not professional law enforcement that found Silas Crane. It was the river itself, or more precisely, it was a man who understood the river as intimately as Silas had. Jacob Mercer was a waterman, someone who'd spent his entire life working the Ohio River system. He transported goods by flatboat, knew every current and eddy, every hidden sandbar and dangerous rapid. He'd met Silas years earlier, had even stayed overnight at the cabin on a few occasions when weather made river travel impossible. Now, Mercer was consumed with guilt and rage. He'd liked Silas, or at least hadn't disliked him. They'd shared meals, swapped stories about river conditions. The thought that he'd sat across a table from a man who was casually murdering travelers filled him with a fury that bordered on obsession. Mercer began thinking like Silas would think. Where would a riverman go if he needed to disappear? Not into the hills. That was unfamiliar territory where he'd stand out, where his river knowledge would be useless. No, a man like Silas would stay close to water. He'd use the rivers as highways, as hiding places, as sources of food and shelter. Mercer began working his way downstream, checking every abandoned shack, every river cave, every location where someone could camp without being easily spotted. He traveled by night, as Silas would. He avoided main channels, as Silas would. He thought like prey trying to become invisible. On September 17th, 3 months after the discovery beneath the ferry platform, Mercer found what he was looking for. There was a place the locals called Devil's Kitchen, a limestone cave system that opened directly onto the river about 15 miles downstream from Harrow's Bend. The entrance was partially concealed by a curtain of willow branches and could only be accessed by water. Inside, the cave widened into a chamber about 20 feet across, with a ceiling high enough for a man to stand upright. Generations of river travelers had used it as an emergency shelter, evidenced by fire, blackened rocks, and ancient initials carved into the stone. Mercer approached silently in his flatboat just after moonrise. He dampened the oars to prevent squeaking, and he let the current do most of the work. As he drew near Devil's Kitchen, he saw the faintest glow of firelight reflecting on the water. Someone was inside. He beached his boat silently, drew the pistol he'd been carrying since beginning his search, and crept toward the cave entrance. Inside, hunched over a small fire, was Silas Crane. He looked like he'd aged 20 years in 3 months. His clothes hung on his frame, filthy and torn. His hair had gone completely white. His hands shook as he held them toward the fire's warmth, even though the September night was mild. But his eyes, those flat, gray eyes were the same. "Hello, Silas," Mercer said, stepping into the firelight with his pistol leveled. Silas looked up without surprise, as if he'd been expecting this moment. "Jacob," he acknowledged, his voice raspy from disuse. "You need to come back with me." "I expect I do." "Why?" Mercer asked, the question that had been tormenting the entire region. "Why did you do it?" For a long moment, Silas simply stared into the fire. Then he began to speak, and what emerged was perhaps more disturbing than the crimes themselves, not because it was dramatic or evil or explained by some grand psychological theory, but because of its very banality. The first one was an accident, Silas said. 1876. A salesman named Whitmore. He was drunk, got belligerent about the fare, came at me with a knife. We struggled. He went overboard, hit his head on the ferry platform going down, was dead before he sank. He paused, feeding a small stick into the fire. I should have reported it. Self-defense, clear as day, but I panicked. Thought maybe people would think I'd killed him for his money. He was carrying quite a bit. So I weighted him down, pushed him under the platform where the currents wouldn't take him. Figured that was the end of it. But it wasn't, Mercer said, his voice hard. No, because I discovered something that night. I discovered how easy it was, how the river would keep secrets if you knew how to ask it, and I discovered. He looked up, meeting Mercer's eyes. I discovered I liked it. The simple honesty of that admission was more chilling than any dramatic confession. Not the killing itself, mind you, Silas continued. I wasn't some frothing madman, but the power, the absolute control. These people would come to me, pay me money, put themselves completely at my mercy, and if I chose, if I simply chose, they would cease to exist, no consequences, no witnesses, just the river swallowing them up like they'd never been born. Rebecca Stillwater, Mercer said. The Murphy brothers, the preacher, all of them, Silas agreed. And others whose names I never knew, drifters, runaways, people no one was looking for. I was selective, careful, never anyone local, never anyone who'd be truly missed. Just travelers passing through who might have met their end in any of 100 ways. They had families, people who loved them. Everyone has families, Silas said. Everyone's loved by someone. That's not special. What was special was my position, my opportunity. How many people get that kind of power? To decide who lives and who dies. To be the ferryman not just across water, but from life to death. He smiled then. A terrible, empty expression. I was Charon, he said. And the Little Kanawha was my river Styx. Mercer wanted to shoot him then. His finger tightened on the trigger. But he'd come too far, fought too hard for justice to end things with a bullet in a cave. Silas Crane would face the law, would face the families of his victims, would pay for his crimes in a way that would be remembered. Get up, Mercer said. We're going back. Silas rose without resistance. He gathered his few possessions, a blanket, a tin cup, the knife he'd been using to cut wood for the fire, and walked ahead of Mercer out of the cave and into the moonlight. They traveled up river through the night, Mercer rowing with Silas sitting in the bow, hands bound with rope. Silas was docile, almost peaceful, as if a weight had been lifted from him. He made no attempt to escape, asked for no mercy, showed no remorse. As dawn broke and Harrow's Bend came into view, a crowd had already gathered. Word had spread somehow, with the mysterious speed that news always traveled in rural communities. Sheriff Morrison was there, along with his deputies, and behind them dozens of people, some of whom had traveled from neighboring counties, all of whom wanted to see the monster who'd haunted their river. When Mercer's boat touched shore, the crowd surged forward. Angry shouts filled the air. People reached for Silas, grabbed at him, pulled him roughly from the boat. For a moment, it seemed like mob justice would prevail, that Silas would be beaten or hanged before he ever saw a courtroom. But Sheriff Morrison fired his pistol into the air, and the sharp crack of gunfire froze everyone in place. "This man will stand trial," Morrison announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. He will answer for his crimes in a court of law. We are not animals. We will not become what he is." The crowd parted reluctantly, and Silas was led away in chains to the county jail. The trial of Silas Abernathy Crane began on November 2, 1893, in the county courthouse at Chester. The proceedings lasted 11 days and drew spectators from 3 states. Newspaper reporters filled the gallery, sending daily dispatches to papers throughout the region. It was the most notorious criminal trial Ohio had seen since the Campbell murder case of 1879. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Harold Webster, a meticulous man who'd spent 2 months building an overwhelming case. He presented evidence in careful layers, creating a narrative of systematic murder that spanned 23 years. First came the physical evidence, the bones, the chains, the personal effects. Each item was catalogued, photographed, and explained. Expert testimony from a medical doctor confirmed the skeletal remains showed signs of violent trauma. The chains were demonstrated to be of sufficient strength to hold a weighted body underwater indefinitely. Then came the identifications, family members who recognized personal belongings of missing loved ones. Rebecca Stillwater's sister identified the locket. Arthur Whitmore's business partner identified the pocket watch. The Murphy boys' parents identified their son's ring, a family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations. The testimony of these families was heartbreaking. Parents who'd spent years wondering what happened to their children. Spouses who'd never been able to move on, trapped in an agonizing limbo between hope and despair. Siblings who'd organized search parties, hired investigators, exhausted their savings trying to find answers that were buried beneath murky water just miles from where they lived. The prosecution also called Jacob Mercer, who recounted his conversation with Silas in Devil's Kitchen. While Silas's confession to Mercer was technically hearsay, the defense surprisingly did not object. In fact, Silas's attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Patrick Donnelly, who seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case, barely mounted a defense at all. Perhaps most damning was the testimony of witnesses who'd seen various victims board Silas's ferry, but never disembark on the opposite shore. Under normal circumstances, such testimony might have been dismissed. It had been years, after all, and memories fade. But witness after witness came forward with eerily similar accounts. They'd seen someone board the ferry during morning fog. They'd watched the ferry disappear into the mist, and when it emerged on the far side, the passenger was gone. "I asked him about it once," said a farmer named Illy Hutchins. "Asked where the man went who'd been on the ferry with me. Silas just shrugged and said he must have gotten off when we reached shore, must have run ahead into the fog. I didn't think nothing of it at the time, but now—" His voice broke. "Now I wonder if I was standing right next to him when he killed that poor soul." The defense strategy, such as it was, attempted to suggest that while Silas may have disposed of bodies, he wasn't necessarily responsible for the deaths. Perhaps these people had drowned accidentally, and Silas had simply hidden the bodies to avoid blame. Perhaps some had committed suicide, and Silas had concealed this to spare their families shame. It was a weak argument, and District Attorney Webster demolished it methodically. He pointed out the chains, the deliberate waiting, the systematic concealment. He noted that 17 different people had accidentally drowned in exactly the same location over 23 years, and their bodies had all somehow ended up deliberately chained beneath the ferry platform. What were the odds? On day 9 of the trial, the defense called its only witness, Silas Crane himself. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as Silas took the stand. He'd been cleaned up for trial, bathed, shaved, dressed in a borrowed suit, but he still looked skeletal, his gray eyes sunken deep in their sockets. Donnelly asked him a single question: "Did you kill these people?" Silas was silent for almost a full minute. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked loudly in the stillness. Outside, a dog barked. Someone in the gallery coughed. Then Silas looked directly at the families seated in the front rows and said, simply, "Yes." No explanation. No excuse. No plea for mercy. Just that single word of admission. Donnelly, clearly not expecting such straightforward honesty, had no follow-up questions. The judge asked Silas if he understood he'd just confessed to multiple murders. Silas confirmed that he did. District Attorney Webster declined to cross-examine what more could possibly be said. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Their verdict was delivered at 3:47 in the afternoon on November 13th. Guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern man named Harrison Blackwell, sentenced Silas to death by hanging. Execution was scheduled for January 19, 1894. Silas showed no reaction to the sentence. He was led from the courtroom in chains, and those who were present said his expression never changed, not fear, not remorse, not even resignation. Just that same flat, gray emptiness that had characterized his entire existence. The execution took place on schedule in the courtyard of the county jail. Despite temperatures below freezing and predictions of snow, over 200 people gathered to witness it. The families of the victims were given places of honor near the gallows. Jacob Mercer was there. Sheriff Morrison stood as an official witness. Even some of the jury members attended, wanting to see justice completed. Silas climbed the 13 steps to the platform without assistance. When asked if he had any last words, he declined. The hood was placed over his head, the noose positioned around his neck. At 7:17 in the morning, the trapdoor opened and Silas Crane fell. The county physician declared him dead at 7:32, after 15 minutes of slow strangulation. The drop had not been sufficient to break his neck. Whether this was accident or intentional, a small extra measure of suffering, no one ever confirmed. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. No one claimed it. No relatives ever came forward. Silas Crane had arrived alone at Harrow's Bend, and he left the world the same way. But his legacy lingered. The ferry operation was shut down permanently. The county built a bridge a half-mile upriver, completing it within 18 months. A remarkable feat of engineering and determination. No one wanted to use the crossing where so many had died. Silas's cabin was burned to the ground. The ferry platform was torn out and destroyed. Attempts were made to forget that Harrow's Bend had ever existed as a distinct location. Maps were redrawn. Road signs were removed. The community tried to erase a chapter of its history that brought nothing but shame. The victims' remains were returned to their families when possible. Arthur Whitmore was buried in his hometown in Pennsylvania. Rebecca Stillwater was laid to rest beside her parents. The Murphy brothers were finally given a proper funeral. But 7 of the victims were never identified. Their remains were buried in a mass grave in the Chester Cemetery, marked only with a simple stone reading, "Unknown travelers. May they finally find peace." The investigation into Silas's past revealed little. He'd been born in Kentucky in 1843, served briefly in the Confederate Army, and then disappeared from all records until his arrival at Harrow's Bend. Whatever made him what he became, whether born or created by war, or simply the random tragedy of a defective soul, remained a mystery. But the questions his case raised echoed long after his death. How many other Silas Cranes existed? operating in society's blind spots, in the isolated places where authority was distant and oversight minimal. How many other ferry crossings, mountain passes, lonely stretches of road had their own secrets buried beneath the surface? And perhaps most disturbing, how many of Silas's victims might there have been if not for a drought? If the water had never receded, would his crimes have continued indefinitely? Would he have died peacefully in his bed, his secrets preserved beneath the murky water forever? The story of Silas Crane remains a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic flourishes. Sometimes it wears an ordinary face and performs an ordinary job, hiding in plain sight, protected not by cleverness, but by our collective willingness to look away from uncomfortable truths. The site of the old ferry crossing is abandoned now, reclaimed by nature. The willows have grown thick over the former banks. The pilings have rotted away. The river has resumed its ancient course, as if nothing ever disturbed it. But local people still avoid the area. They'll drive miles out of their way rather than cross the bridge that replaced Silas's ferry. Because some places hold memories in the soil and water. Some places remember what happened, even when people choose to forget. And on certain mornings, when fog rises from the Little Kanawha and clings to the surface like a burial shroud, people still report seeing strange things. A tall, gaunt figure standing on the eastern bank. The sound of oars cutting through water where no boat exists. The faint metallic clink of chains dragging through mud. They say the dead don't rest easy when they've been forgotten. And 17 souls, maybe more, were hidden beneath those dark waters for far too long. If this journey through one of Appalachia's darkest chapters resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering how evil can exist undetected in the spaces between communities and consequences, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined, voices silenced that deserve to be heard. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment. If it made you think about the invisible people in your own community, the travelers passing through, the vulnerable souls who might disappear without anyone noticing. And comment sharing your own perspectives on this question. In our modern age of constant connection and surveillance, are we truly safer from predators like Silas Crane, or have they simply adapted to new hiding places? Until next time, remember, history isn't just about the famous and the powerful. It's about the forgotten, the overlooked, the buried.